You ever had a quiet place that felt like it belonged to you before anything else did? A little ribbon of water behind the fence, the kind of creek that only people who live here notice, where dragonflies cut the air and the bank gives way under your boots if you stand too close. That was Silver Run for me, and I watched it more than I tended my garden. I swear I did. And then one morning I woke up to a backyard that looked like someone had buried a road where my creek used to be. The first time Evelyn Cross stood on my porch with that clipboard, I thought it was a neighborly visit. I was wrong. My name's Mason Ward, and I've lived on the Hollow for 15 years. Silver Run isn't dramatic, it doesn't roar, it hums. It taught my kids to skip stones. It taught the old dog to sleep beside the water in the afternoons. When the board from Raven Hollow Homeowners Association started talking about aesthetic compliance and drainage risk in the same sentence, I laughed. You can't landscape a creek, I told Evelyn, and she smiled like the kind of person who knows how to turn a polite smile into a paper trail. It began small. A yellow violation letter tacked to the mailbox, photos taken from the street like they were cataloging crimes. You know the drill. Trim your dead branches, remove unsanctioned rockwork, stop unauthorized naturalization. They called the creek an encroachment, which, to them, sounded official. To me, it sounded like someone pointing at a history I grew up with and saying it didn't belong. Evelyn had allies, a few people who liked rules, because rules make you feel safe when you can't control what water does. The escalation surprised me the way a storm does when the sky's been that blue. First, a neighbor's mailbox turned over, then a pile of broken concrete at the mouth of the run, a late-night truck scraping gravel along the lane that left fresh tire tracks no one could explain. I started losing sleep, not dramatic sleep, just the kind that sits in the ribs and nags. Then came the cement trucks. I was standing at the fence with a cup of coffee when they showed up, men with yellow vests like they were hired for a municipal job, and in front of a small group of homeowners, they started pouring like they were sealing a promise. Watching wet concrete swallow the creek felt like watching someone smother a living thing. And it was deliberate. Evelyn gave a speech about safety. We're protecting property values, she said, and her voice cut through the morning like a saw. I walked over, close enough to see the fresh gray smear, and I asked, "Who gave you authority to do that?" She looked at me like she was seeing a pest you squashed because it bothered the carpet. "The board authorized emergency remediation," she said. "You'll thank us if the rain comes." It was the kind of line meant to put a period on any argument. Only the rain did come, and it didn't thank anyone. The first storm after the pour was the kind that makes an honest person curse at the sky. Water, encountering concrete where it had always slipped and slid, had nowhere to go, or rather it went the only place left through the pipes, under foundations, into basements that had never seen more than a damp mop. Mrs. Langley down the road called me at 2 in the morning with her voice shaking because there were fish in her cellar. Henderson's garage floated a few inches on a salty tide of mud. Insurance adjusters started showing up with clipboards of their own, and the polite smiles turned to terse notes about negligent obstruction. Raven Hollow had been run by a board that liked neat lines on a map, until those neat lines started costing people houses. I did what I do when things get slippery. I collected evidence. I took photos from dawn to dark. I bought a cheap drone so I could watch water patterns from above. I walked to the county records office and dug through old deeds in the same way you'd look for a familiar face in an old photo book. The creek had history on its side: easements, old rights-of-way, a stamped map from 1962 that called Silver Run a natural drainage. It was a legal skeleton key. It wasn't dramatic, it was paper and ink, but it was one of those things that made lawmen sit up. Evelyn's emergency remediation had no paperwork. The trucks had invoices from a contractor that insisted they were community-sanctioned, and the signatures were fuzzy, like someone had been signing too fast. There were moments when I wanted to be louder, to stand in the middle of a meeting and shout, but I'd always been the kind of person who does better with a camera than a microphone. I started sending packets, photos, timestamps, the old map to the county environmental folks, to a local reporter who'd called once about a spring flood last year, and to some neighbor who ran a neighborhood forum. Once the story had a map and bad photos, people who read news stories did what people do. They started looking. This is when the board's veneer cracked. When Evelyn spoke at a meeting with the microphones on and the camera rolling, she tried to lean into this safety rhetoric again. "We follow procedure," she said. Board member faces behind her looked tired. I remember her saying, If you had done the right thing, Mason, you wouldn't be in this position. Like she'd decided my right to look out at a creek was the real violation. I answered, quietly, with the copy of the easement in my hand. The silence in that room was like a held breath. Evelyn's mouth tightened into a line where words failed her, I think because a legal paper has a way of making smugness look small. Inspections followed. Men in hard hats and county badges walked the banks and measured, and there are moments when bureaucracy becomes a hammer. The test said the concrete had been poured illegally into a known waterway, that culverts had been blocked, and that the board had disregarded permits. When the county issued orders, they weren't pretty red tags, stop work notices, citations that made the HOA's balance sheet look like a crater. There's a kind of victory that doesn't feel victorious. When the media ran the first piece, it was more relief than triumph. The neighborhood hummed differently, not healed, but no longer gaslit. Evelyn tried defenses that were loud and theatrical. She called it community preservation. She brought contractors to meetings who talked about liability in ways mean nothing to someone whose foundation is sinking. Once she cornered me at a fundraising bake sale, which is a thing that happened, because small towns are theater, and she said, "You think you can embarrass me and win?" I said, "I don't want to embarrass you. I want my creek back." She told me I was sentimental. I told her she'd made sentiment into a legal crisis. There were costs. People lost carpets and heirlooms and the comfortable certainty that some things will always be as they were. Friends we'd known for years argued over whether the HOA had been right to act, whether neutrality with nature was luxury. Some neighbors turned their backs, and some helped tear concrete from banks on a volunteer Saturday, blowing dust in the sunlight and laughing when an ancient root revealed itself like a stubborn truth. The HOA board dissolved under the weight of fines and lawsuits, and Evelyn, well, she moved on to another committee in a neighboring town where no one knew the story yet. Pride, I guess, has a habit of finding new places to land. We restored Silver Run slowly, not perfectly, but enough. There were grants that paid for proper regrading, volunteers who planted native sedge and willow, a contractor who actually knew how water behaved and didn't try to argue policy with it. The sound came back first, a little gurgle that felt like an apology. I'll admit I stood there and listened like a man at a funeral who's been told it's okay to laugh. It's funny how small acts of repair can feel like miracles when there's a ledger of pain against them. What I never say lightly is that this wasn't just about one man's yard or one woman's clipboard. It was about the idea that regulating life down to a neat set of boxes is safer than letting communities decide how to live. It's tempting to villainize Evelyn and make her a cartoon villain of tyranny, but it's more useful to see her as the personifications of systems that prefer order to messiness, profit to process, rules to local knowledge. She had motive, control, and maybe a belief that she was saving something, a version of the neighborhood that matched her vision, but motive doesn't erase harm. So here I am, saying this as someone who watched a creek get buried and come back, who sat through petty meetings and county hearings and made 1,000 small, patient efforts to undo what was done. If you're watching this, I want you to think about the small things in your town that feel like home, a marsh, an old oak, an alley with good murals, and ask who's allowed to decide what happens to them. Because those decisions don't just hit land, they hit people. Tell me what you think. Was I stubborn or right? Was Evelyn protecting property values or ruining lives? Drop your take in the comments. Share a time your neighborhood got torn up by rules. And if you think protecting small, messy places matters, share this with someone who needs to hear it. If you want, there's more legal notes, before and after photos, the list of volunteers who showed up on that wet Saturday. Say the word, and I'll put it up. But for now, let the creek be the thing that ends this story. Listen for it. There's a small laugh in the water, and it's the kind of sound worth defending.